5, 4, 3. Greetings. Welcome to Smart Money Match Capital Introduction Summit. My name is Michael Bryce. I'm the president of BW Cyber Services, and I'll be speaking to you today about the vulnerability of the asset management industry for cyber attacks. I very much appreciate you all joining, and I hope you find some value in today's meeting. A little bit of background about myself. I joined the Marine Corps right out of college, ended up working in what at the time was known as signals intelligence, and was in the first Gulf War, working under the auspices of the National Security Agency. Moved on to eventually becoming a chief information officer, worked on the cybersecurity program for one of the largest hedge funds in the world, and ended up opening my company, BW Cyber Services. Our background and the credibility we bring today, quite frankly, is that we're a vertically aligned cybersecurity consulting firm that does a lot of forensic analysis. And so the activities we do relate between forensic analysis, regulatory compliance, and basically the soup to nuts things that in between. The reason why I mention that is because for today's breakout, I'd like to talk about risk. We could spend a week, 6 months, 4 years on cybersecurity. There's a lot there to unpack. But in terms of a breakout session like this, the idea here is I want to make sure that in the asset management industry, if you're a principal, you understand the risk you're facing from cybersecurity. Because interestingly enough, when I moved into this vertical, I found that the managers that we work with, some of the smartest people in the world and some of the best risk assessors in the world. However, we find over and over that those same individuals do not understand cybersecurity and the risks that come with it. So today I wanted to talk about those risks, and that's what we've got up on the screen here. Before I jump in, though, I also wanted to make a point to say that we will talk about some ways dealing with cyber that you can be breached, just to give you an idea for that as well, and some thoughts on next steps. So as we do that, from a risk perspective, and one other thought I'd like to throw in here before we talk about risks that I think adds to that misconception. Most of us have grown up with IT, information technology. So we've become accustomed to the fact that if your computer doesn't work, you can't get to the internet, the file won't download, it's an IT problem. So you kind of know intuitively when IT doesn't work. And I believe there's an assumption in the world that you're going to know the same way when security doesn't work. And there's nothing further from the truth. As a matter of fact, what I would say is that if your security isn't functioning properly, the only time you're going to know if you don't actually do some active analysis is when the Eastern Europeans or the Nigerians or others around the world, the Chinese, pick one, they're all around the world, decide to target you. And in the asset management industry, you are going to be heavily targeted. And it's not hard. If you are on LinkedIn and your title says anything related to asset management, financial services, hedge, PE, I guarantee you're on somebody's dashboard to target you. So let's kind of take a step back from there then. The one other thing that I'd like to relay here before we jump in is that I see a lot of asset managers making a mistake that IT professionals know security. That is not the case. That's almost like assuming that a dentist could do open heart surgery, or an open heart surgeon could to do a filling. They are two, even though they are both in technology, there are two diverse skill sets. And quite frankly, the security skill sets with cybersecurity are still in their infancy. And so what we do see is a lot of IT people who put the word cyber in front of them. And all I would say is, if you have a program and you have an IT staff or you outsource your IT, it is critical to think of the approach that you want friction between those two organizations and trust but verify. So I think I've done my kind of spiel on how to think about this. Let's jump in on the risks here, because I think this is very important. We see 6 strategic risks that we think all asset managers should be aware of. And we're going to talk about all 6 of those risks. Specifically, as you see here, they relate to, regulatory compliance. And I think most managers get this in that, hey, do we have a piece of paper? What concerns me is I don't think most managers know what is really required, because the regs between the NFA and the SEC CFTC, FINRA, and the European or other regulatory agencies are not always as clear or as prescriptive as we prefer. But I can walk you through what, by and large, your regulatory requirements are. Once you get past that, I think people kind of don't think about the reputational risk, and they don't realize it until they have a bad event happen, and then boy, people seem to get it in spades. More importantly, along with those two, is operational risks, and I'm even going to go so far as to say operational / existential. And I will go into briefly a case study today where an Australian hedge fund was literally put out of business due to a cyber event. Of course, then there are legal risks, and this begs a lot of activities related to when there's a breach, notification, how you do that, what laws you apply to. Related to all this are financial risks. We're going to touch on that because the financial risks actually cover everything that we're talking about here, but they include things like wire fraud. And what a lot of our managers are missing that I'd like to talk to you all about, just make clear, is most of the managers we deal with focus on wire fraud in terms of the outbound wires they send. And that makes sense. That's what we've all focused on. But I would encourage you all to think about the fact that you need to expand your controls to your investor base and help them understand that they are now being targeted probably more so than asset managers when they have their initial investment or there's a valid capital call or fake capital call. Most investors aren't thinking that they need to do multi-factor, pick up the phone and call, double check, whereas I think managers are now. So I just want to make that. And then lastly, there's an assumption often that the program is run by a cyber competent individual or organization. And I'd say more often than not, it's being run by an IT competent organization that may or probably does not know cyber. And even if they do know cyber, much in the same way we have fund administrators to keep our managers at arm's length, I strongly encourage you all to think about the friction between cyber and IT to keep them at arm's length. So let's just jump in and talk about regulatory risks here. Basically, through all of the regulators, you have these 8 activities that you really need to have in place. And I'm going to go through these very briefly. Those activities are a piece of paper with an executive signature. First and foremost, it cannot be an IT director that runs your program or owns it, so to speak. It needs to be an executive, a C-level individual. Once you have that piece of paper, that paper should include the items here that are in 2 through 8. That is, you should have performed a control risk assessment. That's a fancy way of saying, did you go through a checklist of controls to see whether or not you have them or how well you are implementing them? That's your baseline. That's your report card. If you can't measure what you have, you certainly cannot manage it, to quote Edwin Booz. So after you have that risk assessment, you then want to do a threat assessment. And what's the difference here? A threat assessment says, hey, this is who I think might come after me and how they do it. And everybody's threat assessment is different. If I'm a one-person hedge or I do separately managed accounts by myself, my threat assessment may be significantly different than a large hedge fund that has billions of dollars and hundreds of investors and multiple LPs. So the reason why you do the threat assessment is the regs allow wiggle room for organizations to implement their cyber program as appropriate. And usually that as appropriate caveat is linked back to the threat assessment. The next piece here that all the regulators want to see is cyber training. They want to see all your employees get it. And I cannot emphasize how important as an overall enterprise control training is. Train early, train often. Related to training, I'm sure you're all aware of this, although it's not explicitly stated in the regs. We recommend a program of quarterly phishing, simulated phishing attacks to keep your employees on their toes. The next one here, the regulators want you to have done a critical third-party vendor assessment. This is important. There are a number of breaches that have happened where you might be trusting your data with somebody else. They get breached. So the idea is you're still responsible for that. It's still your reputation if your vendor gets breached and your investor information is released. So I want just to make sure that's included. Then we got some acronyms here that I'll walk through real quickly. DR, BCP, and IR. That's disaster recovery plan, business continuity plan, and incident response plans. Those are all regulatory requirements. Of those, what I would tell you that I think is the most critical from an operational perspective, forget the regulators, is disaster recovery. We continue to see people who think they have DR, disaster recovery. They haven't tested it, which is a requirement. And then when there's an issue, they suddenly realize that it doesn't work. So if there's one takeaway on that piece, test your DR. Then they want to see, believe it or not, recommendations that come out of these first 6 items, because at the end of the day, a program isn't just to have a piece of paper with a signature. It's to have vulnerabilities that you identify and remediate over time. And then lastly, the regulators do expect you to have a set of security policies for IT, and that you actually follow your security policies. That one seems to be a hard one for people. I see a lot of people that have policies in the form of a WISP, but they don't follow their policies. And the regulators are really jumping on that now. So what about the reputational risk? Because I want to go into each of these risks here. Regulators, you don't want to give them a reason to come audit you. If you have a breach, have that blast of email that goes out, and you're trying to trick people to click on something, that might give them a reason to do an audit on you. Plus, we're finding more and more current investors are getting spooked when they see their information gets released, or they're targeted and they know the target at them had to have some sort of inside information on their subscription documentation. And then lastly, and this is a big one, institutional investors are now focused heavily on cyber during their operational due diligences. You don't want a cyber red flag if you're looking to get institutional investment. What about the operational risks? Boy, I love this one. It's a scary one. But for asset managers, we see 3 key areas for operational risk. The first is ransomware, and I'll talk about it in a second. But if you're not familiar with ransomware, it's bad juju. It's where there's a software program, in essence, very sophisticated, that locks up your entire system, your PCs, any file servers you may have. Basically, you can't do any work, and your computers become expensive bricks. You pay a ransom, you're extorted, usually in Bitcoin or some other cryptocurrency, to get a key to unlock that. And maybe it will unlock it, maybe it won't. Ransomware is so prevalent that anecdotally I've heard within the last 6 months of 2 organizations that paid ransoms. One was $60 million, another was $37 million. In the US, we're seeing this targeting healthcare facilities. They're targeting everybody. They're successful. And it's one of those equations where there's unlimited reward and almost zero risk, because the perpetrators of these malicious activities are coming from countries where they're not prosecuting. It's amazing that they can get away with this, and they're successful. Wire fraud, boy. I think most asset managers have become aware of this threat and have focused on the outbound side. But I will tell you, you're now going to see your investors targeted on the inbound side. And if an investor loses $500,000, $1 million, even if it's their fault, they're going to blame the asset manager. They might sue the asset manager. They're going to talk bad about the asset manager. And I guarantee you, if you're that asset manager, you're not going to get that investment. And then lastly, the data theft piece. This is what it all comes down to from the litigatory stuff, with regulatory litigatory, because it's subscription documentation primarily. That's where you have PII, personally identifiable information. But it's also the gold standard for what criminals are going after, because once they have subscription documentation, they can target your investors surgically. They can reference paragraphs, sentences, provide all sorts of credentializing information so the investor believes that it's you when it's not. And all they do with all that is they might just change the wiring instructions. Gosh, how simple is that? And I'm telling you, a lot of investors are falling for this. So ransomware, as we talked about, this is a screenshot on the right. And if you see this screenshot, this is one of many, by the way, it's a real one. It's a bad, bad day. So we cannot emphasize enough how important it is to, when you do your assessment, you're going to have recommendations. And I'll walk through some of this briefly, why and how these are so important to prevent you from getting ransomed. So let's talk about legal risk. And a lot of managers don't understand this. In the US, you have to adhere to the privacy laws in all 50 states. That's a nightmare. And the reason why I say that is if you have an investor in California, you've got to apply the California Consumer Privacy Act. If you have another investor in New York, you've got to apply the New York Shield Act. If you've got a third investor in Virginia, Virginia Consumer Data Protection Act, and so on. So this becomes extremely expensive because you have to have a privacy attorney, do the reporting. It's a nightmare. And in Europe, then you've got the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which is very, very onerous. So I just want to make sure you realize there are a lot of tentacles here on the cyber side with respect to risk. And then lastly, financial risk. Boy, this is not just financial, it's existential. So let's just go into this briefly. There was an Australian hedge fund that got put out of business because the manager clicked on a link. He didn't submit credentials that we know of. I believe what happened here is he had software that was not properly patched or current for his web browser. And by the way, there have been some exploits that have come out with Google's web browser that just within the last month, that if you haven't updated, this could happen to you. So this is not a failing on the manager. This is just why it's so critical to understand why you need a good IT organization to patch your software and understand why that's critical. So clicked on a link, took them to a fake site. The site was able to basically determine that he had a browser deficiency due to an exploit that was known, got into his system, and able to, in effect, make a couple $1 million worth of fake payments. The manager caught it, still lost $800,000, but the worst was that the anchor investor and then others lost confidence, pulled out, and the fund went out of business. This is a very real situation. And I would say, quite frankly, I think it happened to just about anybody, which is why it's so scary. So a couple parting thoughts here, and then I'm happy to answer the questions. I almost always get asked, what's the easiest way to get hacked? And you know, that's like saying, how do you get sick, right? Asking a doctor how to get sick. But here's what I will tell you. There are a couple of very, very, very common ways that I think everybody needs to be aware of. The first is if you don't patch or upgrade your software in a consistent, timely manner. What happens is, just like I explained with that Australian firm, you can be exploited through basically no fault of your own and taken advantage of. The other capability here that we see is credential harvesting. And I'm sure everybody who's watching this has seen this, where you get an email from somebody with a link, and if you've clicked the link, it looks like maybe it's an encrypted email or something like that, and they're asking you to log in. Well, what they're doing is they're trying to steal your login password and account name so they can log in as you. So if there's one big takeaway from today, A, patch your systems, B, put multi-factor authentication, which is when you get an SMS text when you log into your email or your third-party accounts, that prevents credential harvesting. And then lastly, please, if you all are sharing sensitive information in email, don't send the password in email to a file that was password protected. We encourage people to password protect their files, but never, ever, ever, never send the password in email. Most criminals are going to break into your email. That's the easiest way they can do it, and then you've given them the keys to it. So a couple more things here in terms of what we see. We see a lot of phishing. This is just an example where, you know, if a criminal can send out 100 million emails that look like it's a bank login and to tell you you need to log into your bank. I'm sure you all are familiar with this. It doesn't seem to work a lot, but if it works with one person in a million, it works great. And it especially seems to work with older Americans and others who are retired and susceptible for their retirement accounts, unfortunately. Working with the FBI, that's what they've told us, that they were targeted on these kinds. More importantly these days is a thing called spearfishing, and this is where they go after you directly. It's very insidious because generally they've looked you up on LinkedIn, especially if you're a new manager or their favorite, if you're a new CFO, because you don't know wire controls, you're eager to please the boss, and you might be able to be tricked into a fake wire with the boss telling you he's on an airplane or she's on an airplane or unavailable because you're new. So we would just have you understand that spearfishing is very insidious. The takeaway here that I would tell you is anytime when doing a wire, always confirm instructions, don't trust it in email, and quite frankly, don't trust anything in email. That's the so what on that one. So final note, and I'm passionate about this one because I see it a lot. A paper tiger compliance program will only satisfy the first risk that we mentioned, which is compliance. It might get you past an audit, but if you have not implemented anything and just had some paperwork done and put a signature on it, put it in file, you have a paper tiger. And let me explain, that's not going to help you with the majority of your risk as we've laid out. Moreover, we find a lot of our clients struggle to buy down their risks with the recommendations we provide. So I would just say, as you move into developing a cybersecurity program, take all of those risks into account with your program and understand that the absolute hardest part is when you have these set of recommendations and you remediate those. So our suggestions for remediation is to break your list into whatever it is, break the lists into those things that are quick hits, don't cost anything, configuration changes, and trust me, if you've done a proper risk assessment, you'll have a bunch of those. And just manage those with precision and discipline. We do it as an outsourced vendor often just because most of our clients don't have that competence. They don't understand the technology, and so it becomes orphaned and sits and becomes a paper tiger. That's the presentation for today. I'm happy to take questions. I appreciate you all coming here. I want to thank Smart Money Watch for having us. And with that said, thank you very much.